this is one of those issues where you get a real division of opinion between economists and non-economists, and a lot of, and the most vocal of those non-economists are probably town planners. So there have been a lot of economic studies of the effect of planning restrictions on housing prices, and they find very big effects using a whole lot of different approaches. And that's a result that's been replicated in city after city around the world. There are dozens and dozens of papers, but economics papers, showing planning restrictions are a very big factor, explaining why housing is so unaffordable. And town planners don't like that and complain, and they don't believe that supply and demand is relevant for prices. They will say that in varying degrees of explicitness. And the general public doesn't like to admit that result, but they don't take part in the academic debates.
So we're talking about restrictions on what you can build in particular areas. So in Brisbane, for example, where I am, we have restrictions on to what extent you can redevelop these old character houses, and a lot of these old character houses, these old Queenslanders, the tin and timber houses, they're protected in the inner city neighbourhoods, and in other state capitals you have similar restrictions for different types of properties, and so it ends up distorting the development that you see, and we end up with in Brisbane we end up with these horrible tall apartment towers in just small pockets of where there's some activity allowed because it was formerly a light industrial or commercial area. But it seems logical to me that we are restricting the supply, because if we had fewer restrictions, and presumably we'd see more medium density development, or at least that's what I think. So it doesn't seem controversial to me that supply restrictions would lead to an increase in prices. It is just... Oh,
well, Gene, now you're sounding like an economist.
Well, and I mean, I read Ed Glazer's recent, I think it's Ed Glazer.
He's done a lot of stuff on the area. In fact, he's maybe the leading expert in the world on this topic.
Yeah. And so, I mean, he's very confident in this impact. Now, you've done research on this, haven't you, Peter? You did research at the Reserve Bank. Would you be able to...
But before we get to that, Jim, can I just to comment on what you just said?
Yeah.
There are two really important... There are lots of planning restrictions. They come in dozens of different variations, but there are two of them that are especially important. One of which is zoning as it's strictly and conventionally defined, which is separation of different uses. Most of Australia's cities, as in fact is the case for a lot of cities around the world, most of our cities are reserved for low density housing. That's single family detached houses. And in most of Australia's cities, as cities around the world, apartments, townhouses, terraces are prohibited. Where medium or higher density housing is permitted, there are height limits. And so even if flats and apartments were permitted at your local train station, there'll be a limit on how high that building can go. Brisbane, actually, what you mentioned, is not a very bad offender in this. And so particularly around the river in Brisbane, there've been a lot of tall apartment buildings, and partly reflecting that, apartment prices in Brisbane are pretty moderate. But in Sydney and Melbourne, the height restrictions are really severe. And so as a result, apartment prices are much, much higher. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so you did research back a few years ago, didn't you, when you're at the Reserve Bank on the magnitude of the impacts. Now, these impacts could be even larger now, given prices have increased so much. But do you recall what sort of magnitudes of impacts you were getting, Peter, from these types of restrictions?
Yeah, so the effects are huge. The way we looked at it was to compare the price of housing relative to the cost of supply. And in a well-functioning market, those price will equal the cost of supply. But planning operates as a supply restriction, sort of just in the same way as a quota or a license to supply will. I mean, a lot of cities have taxi licenses, and it's the same thing, that you have a restriction on output, so the price goes much higher than the cost of supply. And we found when you look at detached houses, the effects are huge in Australia's big capital cities. I think 70%, around 70% in Sydney, about 60% in Melbourne. It was also very large in Brisbane and Perth. And there, I can get into the details of how we actually estimate that. The more important figure for policy is for apartments, because that's where the real demand for extra housing is. That's where the big policy debates are. If we do want more dense housing, it will have to come in the form of urban infill. And again, we find very big effects there, especially for Sydney. I think the effect was about 60% or a bit higher. It raises the cost of housing. In Melbourne, it was moderate, about 20%. And in Brisbane, actually, we didn't find much of an effect. It was fairly small, just a few percentage points. But as you say, prices have risen very substantially in the, 4 years since our data was put together. So those effects will presumably be bigger.